Dr. Lori Moore-Merrell, U.S. Fire Administrator. Oh, look at you. You didn't know we had one, just like the question of the day.
Yep.
Is in charge of not just policy related to wildfires, but making us all smarter when it comes to, anything related to fire. But certainly, though, none of us could have expected what happened in Maui. And Dr. Moore-Merrell is just back from Hawaii and joins us now. Good morning. Thanks for coming on.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Can you explain in layman's terms how this fire spread so quickly? I mean, I guess we sort of get it. It was a confluence of the weather that started it and dry conditions from a drought. Was there more than that?
That is what started it. That's as far as we can tell at this point. It was started as a grass fire. The grasses are very, very dry, as you certainly know,
sure.
Drought-ridden side of the island. And so once those fuels were ignited, they spread very quickly. That grass burned so fast, and it spread to the grasses. Once it ignited the first structure, from there, then you have structural embers that are much larger. We'd had reports from, some of the firefighters saying these embers were very large that were spreading through the air so quickly to ignite other structures. So once you get structure to structure spread with the wind speeds that we had from that hurricane that was nearby, then you get some almost blowtorch efforts spreading structure to structure. And in the fire service, we call it a horizontal fire. And they're very difficult to get in front of because of the wind speeds that are driving the fire, plus the fuel that continues to ignite. So this was a very fuel-heavy, wind-driven fire.
Dr. Moore-Merrell, you've been on the ground for many of these devastating fires, whether they're in high-rise structures, wildfires in the forest, this one in Maui. Have you ever seen anything so destructive that spread so quickly?
This one is incredibly destructive. This is it's very bad. It's almost, you've heard several people describe it as, apocalyptic. Looks like a bomb went off. All of those descriptions are certainly accurate. This one is very, very bad. I will equate it to, a lot of people are saying, oh, it's like the campfire. I would disagree with that. I would equate it more to what we saw in the Marshall Fire in Colorado, the Boulder County area, where it was also, and they had up to 100 mile an hour wind in that fire. It also was a drought, grass-driven fire that went structure to structure. So it's much more like that, even though it's in a much more tropical, obviously flatter area than in the Colorado Springs fire. But this one is bad.
And the Northern California fires, right, of 2019, was it? 2019, 2020? That was probably similar.
Yes, somewhat similar. Anywhere that we have, and, there's a lot of confusion sometimes. People will say wildland fire. This is not a wildland fire. And I want to be really clear because that gets a lot of our decision makers, even a lot of our media folks confused often. We'll say wildland fire. Wildland particularly is the location. Wildfire is what we're worried about. And this conflagration was certainly in a much more suburban, rural type area that was not close to a wildland area. And so the wildfire that spread through this community was incredibly fast, as we said, and obviously very destructive.
From your standpoint, as someone who knows the science of this, do we need more strict regulation in parks and states all over the country that are subject to these kind of fires? And I don't mean Maui, the wildfires.
That's an excellent question. Excuse me. We do have a national code. We have a national fire code. We have national building codes. We even have a national wildland urban interface code. The thing is that when that national code goes to the states for implementation, then a lot of the states will send it down further to municipalities, counties, cities for implementation. And at each step along the way, often decisions are made to strip the code of some very important pieces that can, avoid some of the destructiveness, build resilience in communities. And the unfortunate part is that we have often building community that will say, well, we can do it faster and cheaper. We can build this if you'll relax the codes. And these things are taken out. People listened to that, and now we see these continuing to happen. So I would say we have the regulations, we have the codes. It's their implementation that we need. It's the enforcement of the codes that we need, the adoption and enforcement of the codes. That's what's going to make a difference, particularly if we're going to continue to build toward risk. You know, that's a thought that we're trying to really promote so people can understand. If we're going to continue to clear trees and put communities in areas that have burned for hundreds of years, that are fire-prone geography, then that's building toward risk. And often the people who live there are not informed of that risk, or they don't understand it.
Yeah, Doctor, I know you were there yesterday and over the weekend, and I know your investigation is just beginning. There's a lot of recovery efforts still that are underway. But initially, is there anything that could have been done to maybe, I don't want to say have prevented this, because you just explained that communities are built in these areas where there's wildlife, but initially, is there anything that could have been done to perhaps prevent the spread so quickly?
That's a difficult question, just because you had the, natural forces coming together. Had this just been the grass-driven fire with their normal trade winds, the fire department would have been much more capable of getting in front of it. The problem is that you had this coupled with, and of course we look to all the climate change that we're seeing. We're seeing these storms that are not natural. They're occurring in places that, and coupled with other natural events. And so it was the hurricane force winds plus the fire and the time of ignition, all of those things coming together that, unfortunately, pardon the pun, made the perfect storm that allowed this natural disaster to happen.
So, a stupid question maybe, but one of the things that's fascinating about the horror of those photos is there's some palm trees that survived. Is that just native vegetation and the trees got lucky? It just struck me as odd.
It is a lot to do with the wind currents at the time where the fire was driven. It also has to do with, as I mentioned, the horizontal nature of the fire. So there were several trees that were burned up their trunks, but not the tops. And so this was a low-to-the-ground fire because that's where it was finding fuel, plus that's where the winds were driving, right? So fire needs three things. It's got to have an ignition source, it has to have a fuel, and it has to have oxygen. And so it had an abundance of both fuel and oxygen low to the ground. And so the horizontal fire spread that the wind drove is why you see some of those markings.
What do you want us to do? How can we be better? This is not a Smokey the Bear PSA. How can we literally take more responsibility now?
There are ways that we can think about our communities. And as I said, as we have communities, almost 1/3, in fact, of our population in the U.S. now lives in fire-prone areas. And we need homeowners, residents, to make sure that they are diligent in keeping themselves safe and being savvy about having what we would call fire-adapted communities. So reducing vegetation around your home, understanding where you live, and if it is indeed fire-prone. In fact, the U.S. Fire Administration right now, we have a project underway to develop a fire index, a fire risk index, much like we have with the flood index, right? And so we're working to develop this index so that we can better understand the level of risk across our nation. And so that kind of communication, but then having people understand, again, fire adaptation, having residential sprinklers, even if you have to retrofit, that is huge. If you're build with fire-resistant building materials. These are things that are all in the codes that I mentioned. And then know your way out. Often we build communities that has only one ingress, one egress out. And that was very difficult, too, in the Maui fire, that the Front Street area, one way out. And a lot of folks, this happened so quickly that finding your way out once it started and once all this ignition happened, getting through the smoke and understanding your way out becomes very problematic. And so knowing that, just like we teach in structure fires, we want you to know at least two ways out, know your evacuation, how to get out of your home. It's the same applies in our communities. You need to know at least two ways out if possible.
I found you fascinating, Dr. Moore-Merrell, when I heard you speak at the Homeland Security Conference here in Chicago a few weeks ago. So thank you for being with us. How would you grade our country as a whole on fire safety right now?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking, and thank you for the compliments. Right now, I think we have a large level of complacency. Often we learn things on the back of tragedy, and I think that's going to occur this time. I think this has gotten the attention of the nation, it's gotten the attention of the world, and understanding how these things can happen, and they will happen. And I think that if we can not let this tragedy go to waste, and we can learn and be active, proactive about becoming fire adapted, about becoming aware of what is possible, not only in your home, because fire is fast wherever it occurs. We have building materials today. We have plastics in our home. Wherever this occurs, the fuel load is such that it's going to move fast. In fact, you're much more likely to die in a fire, even in your home today, than you were 40 years ago. You don't have as much time to escape. Fire is fast, and that is across the board, whether it is in a wildfire like we've witnessed in Maui or whether a fire.
Whoops. I thought we lost you there for a second. Sue and Rochelle, trying to understand the dry grass can start on fire by itself. That'd be our last question, Doctor. And that question is, forget about the aesthetics for a moment. We should water the dry grass, yeah?
Where we have the water to do so. We've got a watershed problem across the nation as well. We have to understand our water infrastructure, because when these fires occur, it's difficult to suppress without water. And so
that's a great point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And right. So we have to understand what's at play. The dynamics of climate change are very much impacting our capability not only to understand the fires that are occurring, but expect them to occur, but then also assuring that we have water to be able to suppress where it's needed.
Thanks for making us better. Thanks for making us smarter. And we need to listen more. We hope you'll come back.
I really appreciate you highlighting this information, focusing on it, and spreading the information to your listeners. So thanks for having me.
It's
Thank you, Doctor.
Lori Moore-Merrell, and official title is U.S. Fire Administrator.
Yeah, she's excellent.
Yeah, she really is. Thanks for getting her on the show.